Hey y'all, welcome back to my channel. It's me, Tiffany. So I have this series on my channel where I read 4 books published within a decade. I've done like the 1900s and I've done the 1910s, and now I am doing the 1920s. So if this is the first time you've been to my channel or you haven't watched the other videos in this series, I try to make sure I have not read these books before, and if they're popular, great. If they're not popular, oh well. It's just 4 books that sound interesting to me. I'm not really comparing themes and all that stuff, especially because they're not always published within the same genre or even the same country. The only thing in common is when they were published. So the order I talk about these books are just by publication order, because when I make the list of which books I'm going to read, that's how I do it. It makes it simple for me, right? So I talked about this first book in my 2021 mid-year wrap-up, basically, where I talk about every book I've read from January through June. So the order I talk about these books are just publication order, because when I'm looking up these books, I make my list of what I'm going to read. I do it by publication order. It just makes it simple, right? And I've talked about this first book in my 2021 wrap-up, where I talk about every book that I've read from January to June. That is a long video. I didn't go into much detail as I would like, because I had to go over so many books. But if you did watch that and you remember some of these points, I'm going to bring some of them up here too, but hopefully I can go into more detail. So, as I've mentioned in a couple of videos, I didn't know The Secret Garden was going to be racist. I just picked it because it sounded interesting. And that's what happened here. It's another racist children's book that I did not know it was racist when I picked it up. So the first, Dr. Dolittle. This is actually a series. I'm not going to continue with the series. And my only exposure to Dr. Dolittle was the first Eddie Murphy movie. I have not watched the Robert Downey Jr. one. I haven't watched the sequels to Eddie Murphy. Thinking about it, I should have been like, well, this is a 20, so the plot's probably going to be different, right? I didn't think about it. I was just like, oh, I remember watching that movie as a kid. I don't even fully remember that movie, because I think I've only watched it once or twice, and I think I was in the single digits as far as my age goes, but I thought it would be similar, right? I was wrong, and it is extremely racist and blatantly racist, and apparently there's edited editions. I know of the first book. I don't know if they've edited the other books in the series. I didn't look into them. I've only looked into the first book because I have no interest in the other ones, but with a lot of these classics, I do like to kind of look at the history and stuff before I make this video, but most of the time I don't do it before I read them. I do look through classics and see what I want to read, but I read more historical stuff afterwards, right? And there are edited versions of this book to make it less racist, because apparently the original version was extremely, extremely racist. And just reading the edited version I had, which it doesn't say it's edited, but it's also a children's book, so they probably would just leave that out and pretend the original didn't happen. During when they're colonizing Africa, India, what the British people did back in the 20s and stuff, right? And so Dr. Dolittle basically goes broke trying to take care of all these animals, and instead of knowing how to speak to them, he had to learn it, which I did like that. He goes down to Africa, and it doesn't say which African country. It just says Africa, is a giant country instead of a continent with multiple countries. And there's a lot of slurs used in this, and a lot of comments that are disgusting. And then the African prince of whatever nation he, got captured by, he helps bleaches this man's skin so he can get this damsel in distress because he liked Rapunzel. And there's a whole skin bleaching scene. And there's just a lot to this that I was just Like I did not expect skin bleaching and stuff in this. I just thought this was a guy who talked to animals and was a vet. And yeah, so I did not know this was racist going in. And when I started looking things up, apparently this is on a lot of lists as like being a very racist text. And maybe I should do some more looking into it, which this is my opinion. Like, I don't necessarily think it's wrong to read text with racist overtones or blatantly racist, especially if you know this going in and you can read it for like, especially also if it's written back in the day, because it does tell you the mindset of people and what's acceptable and stuff. So academically, I totally think it's fine. But I don't want to see this stuff in adult books either. But being caught off guard with it in children's books, especially multiple times, it really, like none of it's fine. But if it was an adult book and I saw racist stuff in it, especially from the 1920s, I kind of expect that. But racism was just so prevalent in society that it's okay just to do this stuff and use slurs and bleach skin in children's books. Like, when it's in children's books like that, that tells you how ingrained into society it is. And while I am doing time traveling through books, as an academic level, this is good to know. I don't think it's good that it was ever there, but, if you're trying to study how mindsets and stuff were back then, you're going to find this stuff, right? But I didn't know it was there, and I'm definitely going to start looking up children's classics more, so that way I'm at least not caught off guard. But I do think racism in children's books should be brought up more outside of just like Huckleberry Finn. Like, that's like the only one that came to my mind when it comes to racism in children's books. We just don't talk about it enough. And yeah, we can read them, but I do think that you should discuss, hey, these elements are in there, because if you just pick these, if a parent doesn't know and just picks these up and wants to read them to their child, they're going to be thrown off guard. They're going to be like, what the heck, and it's very harmful if people don't know these are in there. I don't, like, you can still read them, but I do think there should be some kind of warning or discussion about it. That way, parents will know whether or not they should read this to their children or find something that's more appropriate, And I know that was a long conversation for the first book, but that was the only one I had, like, any actual, like, issues with out of the series, and it just happens to be the first one. But yeah, if you're going to read this to your child, I wouldn't. Even in the edited version, there's slurs and stuff in it. I don't know if there's an edited version, but I would just stick to the Eddie Murphy movies if you want your kid to be exposed to Dr. Dolittle. The second book I'm going to talk about is Cain. This is not a traditional novel. I didn't know this going in. I was just like, oh, this sounds interesting. This is from like the Harlem Renaissance. And apparently it was somewhat of a hit when it came out, but it went out of print for a while. And then when people started wanting to study more of the Harlem Renaissance, it got republished. And there are short stories, there are poems, like just a mix of things, which is interesting. Like, I have read collections of people's works before, and this isn't a collection. This is actually meant to be a mix of poems and short stories and whatever else that they felt like writing into this at the time. It is short, like, it's only 116 pages. And this isn't something you read in one sitting, in my opinion, or at least I didn't. You need to digest this slowly, And there is so much to get out of this. This is incredible. I don't know why I've never like seen this higher up on like a list of classics, especially from the Harlem Renaissance. That was a great, beautiful time in literature. And this was apparently one of the first books that came out during that time. If you have time to dedicate to a slower read, I would do this because, it's some of it's very eccentric and stuff, but because the format changes and stuff, that's why I suggest maybe not in one sitting. You can get so much about the culture at the time of it and the mindsets, and the language is beautiful. It's lyrical. It's really great. I totally recommend this. And yeah, just whatever you're doing, just stop and take the time to read this. You won't regret it, I promise. So the next book I want to talk about is Bread Givers. And I actually kind of had a hard time finding this book. I listened to it through audiobook on audiobooks.com because I wanted a free trial just to check out something besides Audible, right? And this is about a Jewish immigrant family in the 1920s. They are poor and is very patriarchal, which, as I said, there are problematic books. I personally think it's okay to read those, especially if you're going to study them or whatever, but they should have their problematics out in the forefront. If you're going to read and talk about them, people should know they're in there, know what to expect, and understand why they're in there. It's wrong that it is, but they were. So the father in this, because it basically follows this girl who wants to get out of her house, make a life for herself, get a college degree. She works. And back in the 20s and stuff, big cities had boarding houses. So you could rent a room, not like a hotel, but kind of like a hotel. So instead of a full-fledged apartment, you kind of just got a room, right? And you pay by the week. This was common back then. And there would be women only or men only boarding homes because they didn't want to mix the two sexes, right? Especially since women didn't typically work all the time. So she was paying her way through college, and, her dad's wanting her to get married, and it's very patriarchal. They're Jewish. The man basically is the head of the household, makes all the decisions, that thing, right? And he is very, very, sexist because of this. It's blatant. And she tries to navigate trying to be her own woman in a sense that made sense at this time. If you're going to read this and you're new to classics or you don't know much, the way feminism is or was then versus now, it's different. They had not different priorities, but it was just different, right? Women couldn't even have a bank account at this time. So she's navigating through that, and she goes through kind of dating, and they're wanting to get her married off because, women had to get married young and have babies, and especially they kind of want her to marry another Jew, and it navigates poverty, I think, very well. And I like her mother a lot. She still has some of these patriarchal ideas, but you can tell she truly loves her kids. But she even does stuff like, well, I was willing to walk this far for you, so why won't you walk this far for me even though you have class? Which is, toxic in itself. But it's realistic. You can tell she really loves her kids because she was actually willing to walk 4 hours even though her husband would have been mad about it. She wanted to see her daughter and give her daughter food and help her survive. But, she's not this perfect saint, and I appreciate it. It makes a full-fledged character. All of these characters are very fleshed out. I had a hard time finding this book. Every time I would see, a reference to it, it'd be in another book, an anthology, and just talk about, prominent masterpieces in Jewish literature. I don't know. Maybe that's just, where I'm at, though. maybe other places find this a little bit easier. But yeah, I really enjoy this. The writing was rather simple. It wasn't hard to keep up with. And the reason I mention that up, because there's nothing wrong with more lyrical, like, writing styles and stuff. But if you're new to classics, or maybe you don't like as much complex reading, this might be your gem. Or maybe you want the complex reading, so you don't want something that is as simple, you know? That's the reason why I mention it. But yeah, I do definitely recommend this. It's like a little gem that I did not expect to enjoy as much. I didn't really have any expectations, to be honest, but I do enjoy it. And if you want to read about a low-income family that are immigrants and a girl trying to make her way in a time that made it almost impossible, this is a way to go for you. And like, she does have some mindsets that make you frustrated, especially reading this through a modern lens. But it doesn't take away how enjoyable of a read this is. So the last book I'm going to talk about, I mentioned this in another video. I mentioned this in Zelda, and also technically in between like the January and June like list of books. So I'm going to mention it again. And this one is a more complex read. The Trial. Boy, I did not know what I was getting into when I picked this. This author, Franz Kafka, pops up everywhere, mostly with Metamorphosis from my experience when I was looking him up. That seems to be a little bit more of a popular text than The Trial, but The Trial was still very popular. Ew. So, the whole premise of the book is this guy gets arrested. He don't know why. Nobody knows why. And he's let go to basically do what he needs to do for a year. And then he gets rearrested. It's very confusing. It's very frustrating. Because I don't even think the people arresting him knows why he's being arrested. And it's just, if you read this too fast, like I had to go back and read several passages over or several chapters over. Like it actually took me a little while to read this. And it is interesting. And I like the message of you can't just blindly trust the judicial system or Big Brother in that realm. You know, you just can't blindly trust things. And, you know, basically it's a critique on the, like, blind trust to the judicial system and, you know, all the courts, all of that, right? And I do like that theme. I don't know if I'm going to read other books by him. I kind of want to because I didn't know the way this was written. So maybe that made it a little bit harder of a read for me than it would have if I knew it was going to be complex in advance. But as I said, I usually do the research after I read because with classics, it's hard to avoid spoilers when you start looking things up, right? Unless you're just looking at lists. But I heard Metamorphosis is weird as well, but since I've kind of gotten exposed to his writing style, I think I might eventually give that a chance when I'm in the mindset of I want a challenge. But yeah, like, it basically takes place through a year, and nobody knows what's going on. He gets lawyers and stuff. He has no answers to anything, so he's just doing his best to live that last year of freedom before it all gets taken away. And it is a trip. I don't know how to explain more without spoilers, but since nobody knows what's going on, I don't want to go into super details of the story because you know as much as this guy knows, which is nothing. So any type of spoilers outside the basic premise, I feel like would give away way too much. But it's not a super long book. It's under 300 pages. But it does feel longer if you're not used to this guy's style, I think. Okay, guys, that was it. So next I'll do the 1930s. If there's any books from this decade that you enjoy, let me know because I'm still going to read books from the 1920s when I find ones I like, you know. Or if you've read these, tell me what you thought of them, if you agree or disagree with me. And I will see you next time.